I think for the last 30 years, it has been the other way. We have to force North Korea to denuclearize before we get to peace. And we're flipping that around and saying, you actually need to get to peace because North Korea is in a siege mentality. And they say, you got to drop your hostile policy. And how do you do that? You negotiate a peace agreement. And that begins the process of normalization. That begins the process of trust building. And that hopefully will lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula.
That's the voice of Christine An, founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Collina.
Welcome back to Press the Button, and thank you for joining us for our 67th episode. We start this episode on a sad note to honor Dr. Bruce Blair, who passed away over the weekend. Bruce was the co-founder of the Global Zero movement for the elimination of nuclear weapons, a former Minuteman ICBM launch control officer whose experiences really fueled his drive to rid the world of nuclear threats.
Yeah, Michelle, this is a truly sad day. I've known Bruce for over 20 years, and what an incredible loss for our field. He was such a visionary, between founding of the Global Zero movement and so many other things. He really laid the groundwork for so many of the issues that we're working on today. For example, de-alerting, no first use, and eliminating ICBMs. Bruce was the original thought leader on many of those issues, and up until his death. And lastly, I just want to say what a great person he was. He was so generous with his time and his thoughts. Was a real inspiration for many of us, including me. He spent a huge amount of time with me and Bill Perry in the preparation of our recent book. I don't think we could have done it without him. So tremendous sense of loss for me and the community. And, Bruce, wherever you are, we will miss you.
And we'll do our best to carry on the work. Tom, who do you have lined up for us for early warning?
I had a great interview with Ariane Tabatabai, Middle East Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, to talk about the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Iran nuclear deal and what has come since, and the recent attacks at Iranian nuclear facilities. So a great conversation. Please join us.
And after that, I speak with Christine An, the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ. This month marks 67 years since the Korean Armistice Agreement brought an end to the fighting in the Korean War. But as Christine points out, the war itself is actually not over. She walks us through the interrelated issues of peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, and how by flipping the script the United States has been following for decades, we might yet achieve both.
We have some exciting news. Beginning next week, we are bringing back the question and answer segment. So if you have a nuclear-related question you want to get answered on the air, please tweet us at PressButtonPod or email us at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We've always enjoyed this segment and we can't wait to bring it back. As always, please click the subscribe button and give the show a rating if you're enjoying it. Please tell someone else about the show today. We'd really appreciate it.
I really can't wait for the Q&As, and we're going to be doing them a little bit differently this time, so stay tuned to see how we do it. But with that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
All right. Thank you, Del, and welcome to Early Warning. This week, we're talking about Iran because this month is the 5th anniversary of the Iran nuclear deal, otherwise known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And also this month marked new attacks on Iran's nuclear program. So where are we? Are we heading to war, or will a Biden administration fix all of this? Time will tell. Here to help us answer these questions is Ariane Tabatabai. She is the Middle East Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. She also came out with an article just this week in Defense One with John Wolfstall called "Force Won't Much Slow Iranian Nuclear Progress, but Something Else Can." And I think maybe diplomacy is that something else. Ariane, thanks for being here with us this week.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Tom.
So tell us, where are we? Here we are at the 5-year mark. Of course, the Trump administration withdrew from the deal 2 years ago. So what is the status of the deal now?
Well, the status of the deal is that the deal is still essentially on life support at this point. Iran, of course, has started to dial down its implementation of the deal, has resumed certain nuclear activities. We've talked about this in the past. And so the breakout time, the amount of time that Iran would need to acquire enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, has been shrinking steadily. But there are some positive, some good news, I guess. The main piece of good news, in my view, is that Iran is continuing to work with the IAEA to provide the inspectors with access to its facilities as it was provided for by the deal, although there are questions there as well. There are questions about the status of some facilities and some of Iran's past activities. But at least Iran hasn't kicked out inspectors and refused working with them. So that's the piece of good news. It's mixed. It's a mixed bag of results so far. The deal is still technically in place, though it is not. All of the sort of restrictions and limitations that it had imposed on Iran's nuclear program are no longer there.
Got it. Now, just to be a little daydreamy here, where do you think we would be today if Trump had never pulled out of the deal?
Well, this is a challenging question to answer because it really depends on what would have happened otherwise, right? If the president had accepted the Europeans' plan, for example, in 2018, of keeping the deal in place and working with the Europeans to build on it, to get some sort of agreement on Iran's missile program, to start to address regional issues, I think we would be in a much better place than we are today. But really, it depends on whether or not all of the other things that have happened would have taken place. For example, would the United States still have killed one of Iran's top military commanders, Qasem Soleimani? That would have been a big question mark, right? So, there's so many variables that are just hard to kind of, it's hard to isolate a single thing. But I think if we had decided to follow the Europeans' plan, we would have been in a much better position today.
Let's focus down on what's happening in the nuclear program today, particularly the explosion at Natanz on July 2. What do we know about that now?
So far what we know is that there's been a series of kind of seemingly random, mysterious explosions and fires taking place throughout Iran. That includes one nuclear facility, that's Natanz, as you were mentioning, which is where Iran is doing the bulk of its enrichment currently, and where it's doing a lot of work on research and development for its enrichment program. And the part of the facility that was hit is where Iran has been doing a lot of R&D on centrifuges. But there's also been other facilities, military sites, civilian sites, factories, power plants, ships that have been targeted, that have been burning, where you've had explosions. So there is increasingly evidence, it seems, that there is something going on that is not a series of random things going on, and that it's perhaps part of a broader coordinated campaign designed to scale back Iran's military and nuclear capabilities. So that's what we know in terms of the context within which this explosion happened. In terms of the impact, so far, we don't have a lot of good data about how much damage was actually done. The Iranian, the spokesperson for the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, which oversees Iran's nuclear program, was actually kind of more forthcoming than usual in terms of stating that, there was damage to the research and development efforts. And we know that, at least from the reporting that's come out, we know that the incident has set back Iran's enrichment, research and development work by at least a few months. Some estimates say 2 years. That seems to be kind of, going back to your term, a bit daydreamy, but certainly by a few months.
Now, so what happens next? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, the U.S. Assassination of Soleimani in January raised the fears of war with Iran. Are we back at that spot? Is there broader military conflict possible?
Yeah, I mean, that is always a possibility, unfortunately. I think it very much depends on what else is in store in the United States, in Israel, in Europe, and of course in Iran. In my view, the Iranians are still trying to wait and see what happens in November. As you mentioned, Vice President Biden has essentially promised to return to the deal should Iran also accept to return into compliance with it. And so I think that the Iranians are just kind of trying to sit back and wait until November. Whether or not that's a possibility politically remains to be seen, because if these sort of coordinated attacks keep happening, perhaps target other nuclear facilities or another high-ranking Iranian official or military commander is killed, then they may be compelled to actually respond. So I think that that's part of what remains to be seen. The other part of it is, of course, what else the Trump administration has in store. Remembering that the administration is trying to extend the arms embargo that was supposed to be expiring in October. It has threatened to do so by snapping back UN sanctions, which again is going to place a big question mark over the fate of the nuclear deal. So there are a number of variables that come into play here.
Thank you. Ariane, that is the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for being here. And just remind our listeners that Ariane is the Middle East Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and check out her new article on Iran with John Wolfstall in Defense One. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Today, I am thrilled to welcome Christine on to the show. Christine is the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure women's leadership in peace building. One of my favorite Christine stories, in 2015, she led 30 international women peacemakers from 15 countries across the demilitarized zone from North Korea to South Korea, walking with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ. She's the co-founder of the Korea Peace Network and has organized peace and humanitarian aid delegations to North and South Korea. You have probably seen her writings, which have appeared in publications that include the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, Time, and many more. And she has appeared on many media outlets, including the Samantha Bee Show Full Frontal. Christine was one of the inaugural grant recipients of our Women's Initiative, and I am proud to call her a friend and colleague. Christine, welcome.
Oh my God, Michelle, it's so great to be on your show. Doesn't it seem like ages since we were together in Hawaii?
Way too long ago. Can I come back? Can you somehow get me back there?
The place to be in the United States in the pandemic, I have to say. Luckily, we are an island.
So going straight into the issues, July 27th marks the 67th anniversary of the armistice signed by the United States, China, and North Korea that established a ceasefire and promised a peace treaty to end the Korean War. But that peace treaty, as you often talk about, never materialized. So what are the prospects for a formal end to the war, and why does it matter?
Well, right now it may feel as if prospects to formally end the Korean War are not in sight. But from my vantage point, I think the architecture has been built. And I think that the conditions will be ripe. I think in the next administration, whoever is, will have to confront this and address this. This is, as most Americans don't realize, the longest standing U.S. overseas conflict. This is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. This is one of the most brutal wars that the U.S. fought. The systematic erasure of this war, I think, has a lot to do with our misunderstanding of North Korea. I think it also kind of withdraws U.S. culpability and responsibility on the Korean Peninsula. And, an armistice is a ceasefire. And, I think we saw in the period of the Fire and Fury in 2017 that resuming this war, it's kind of complicated because on the one hand, you have a ceasefire. It halted the fighting, the 3-year war that killed 4 million people. In 3 years, 4 million lives, mostly Korean, innocent civilians. It ended with this armistice agreement where the military commanders that signed the U.S. on behalf of the UN command, which included South Korea and 15 other countries, and then the North Koreans, on behalf of the voluntary, China's voluntary army, because China didn't want to officially be in the war, though we know Mao's son fought and died in the war. But they promised within 90 days of that ceasefire to return to negotiate a political settlement. It was the military settlement, and they promised a political settlement, and that was supposed to be a peace agreement, and that never happened. And so now we are living the effects of an unresolved state of war. And that's where we have, massive militarization. We have not just North Korea possessing nuclear weapons. Obviously, the U.S., as Plowshares knows well, but South Korea, too, is caught in all of this. And so from our vantage point, that is not leading to security. That is certainly not leading to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula or our world. And so we need a new approach. And I think that's where Women Cross DMZ and the global peace movement that we have been a part of is really saying, this is enough. It's time for a new approach that embraces peace, reconciliation, and a new kind of process that is democratic, that is participatory, that will lead to a more sustainable and enduring peace agreement and process.
So I'm really curious to hear more when you talk about this new approach. What would the first steps of that look like? What are the first things that especially the U.S. could do to take action?
Well, it's certainly, let's just say it first and outright, it's not the John Bolton approach. It's not the Libya model. It's not the Iraq model. Because I think, especially among liberals and Democrats, there's this attacking Trump for meeting Kim Jong-un. From our perspective, we thought that was a great thing. You always meet and make friends with your enemies. That is just a principle of diplomacy and peacemaking. But I think the problem has been that effort at that high level has not been backed by actual policies. And so what we need is the U.S. to abandon its policy of maximum pressure, which has been largely in the form of sanctions, which has been largely in the form of political isolation, military exercises. None of these things are actually building trust. None of these things are actually dialing back the tensions. And so what we need to do is to abandon that. And, the predecessor to maximum pressure, which was a gentler, nicer version, was strategic patience. And our concern is that if there is a Biden administration, that we're going to go back to some version of strategic patience, because we have seen and heard from a lot of the experts who were in the Obama administration, who will likely be in the Biden administration, kind of regurgitate these things that will perpetuate the status quo. And we're in a new day. We don't have money to spend. As I think we've seen quite clearly, what the pandemic has laid bare is our typical approach of militarism, investing in all these weapons of mass destruction. We don't even have money. We don't even have the capacity to provide protective equipment for our frontline essential workers. We're in a new moment. And I think the Korean War and ending the longest standing U.S. conflict, which is so symbolic, actually, in so many ways, because it set forth this industrial complex. In those 3 years, U.S. defense spending quadrupled. I mean, it just set forth the U.S. to be the world's military police. And I think Americans are saying, we don't want that anymore. We need to look at our problems at home, the inequality, the gross absence of a social welfare system that can't even handle this pandemic. We are the shame to the world that we can't even provide and take care of the people. And I think the uprisings and the way that the police and have just abused and brutalized Black people for this whole nation's history is just, we're at a reckoning, not just because of all these things, but because the two Koreas want peace. Because the two Koreas began a process in 2018. They signed two big declarations, the Panmunjom Declaration and the Pyongyang Declaration. They signed an inter-Korean military agreement that said, we're going to make the DMZ a truly demilitarized zone. We're going to start removing landmines. We're taking down the guard posts. We're going to stop the propaganda. And that process was beginning. And the two Koreas said, we're going to link the trains even so that we can begin the process of normalization. But who put their boot down on those train tracks? The United States. Pompeo literally called up South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa and said, whoa, wait a minute. You are going way too fast. And we need to have some commitments from North Korea about their commitment to denuclearization before we allow you to go and pursue inter-Korean peace. I just think we need to see that quite clearly. Americans want to have North Korea no longer be a threat. Well, let's look at the whole picture here. Let's look at what the U.S. policy and position has been against North Korea for the last 70 years. And let's look at what we're doing to our key ally in the region in the conflict who wants peace with North Korea.
That's something that's always so striking to me when I read articles. There's this focus on the U.S.-North Korea relationship, and it totally ignores that we have, this strategic ally on the peninsula who also has, obviously an incredible stake in the outcomes and is a participant.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Moon Jae-in is not just some new guy that emerged from the Candlelight Revolution in 2016. I mean, he's somebody that served in the South Korean military. He was in the DMZ. He was based there. He's a human rights lawyer. He served as the chief of staff for the last liberal administration. He has some serious chops in doing inter-Korean reconciliation and negotiations. And so the great thing that's super exciting is that, so his term ends in 2022, and they just had parliamentary elections this spring, and his party won a huge landslide victory. I mean, a lot of it is because the way South Korea, as we know, has been such a global model in dealing with the pandemic. But it's also, it just gives him a huge platform to push his signature policy, which is he wants an end to the Korean War. He wants to see peace on the Korean Peninsula. His mother is from North Korea. The way that we are given this conflict, delivered to us on, mainstream media, cable news, is that it's just about nuclear weapons. Absolutely. We know that if there was a renewed conflict, that in the opening days, just in using conventional warfare, 300,000 people would die instantly. And if nuclear weapons were used, I mean, do we even have to provide figures? But they, the Congressional Research Service says up to 25 million people would be impacted. Okay, so we don't want to go down that route. We have to avoid that at all costs. We have to begin the process to actually dismantle the nuclear weapons, in not just in Korea, but all over the world. But I just think it's super exciting that South Korea is at this moment, President Moon has this agenda, and now he has the full power of a National Assembly to back him up. And so I think he is in the process of trying to get the Panmunjom Declaration ratified. Many people may remember as the two Korean leaders, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, shook hands. They crossed that little, dividing line, the military demarcation line at Panmunjom in the DMZ. And, they signed the Panmunjom Declaration. They said, we're ending the Korean War. The Korean War is over. And we need to negotiate a peace agreement that includes the United States and, also in consideration of China, because they have been a key party, obviously, in the Korean War.
Shifting to the work that you do and you focus on, Women Cross DMZ really brings the perspective of women peace builders, particularly those from families, locations, and communities affected by the war, into the policy and public debate. And just hats off to you for showing us how to build those authentic relationships to do so. I'd love to hear what you have learned over the course of this journey with Women Cross DMZ.
Since we started this journey, we've been so focused on having a seat at the table. And this will be a focus. We won't go away. We'll keep calling for this because the data point is when women are involved in peace processes, it leads to a peace agreement. It leads to a durable, sustainable peace agreement. Why? Because our perspectives are of half the world's population, of course. I mean, I just think, what if women were involved in the signing of the armistice? Would we still be at each other's throats for 70 years? I don't think so. I think women have a different set of priorities. I think we're willing to cross lines, whether it's religious, ethnic, ideological lines, because we see the benefit of cooperation, of dialogue, of having a different way than using militarism, which is use of violence and over to resolve conflict. We say, come on, that is so ridiculous. And so when you look at the history of the role that women have played, they have been on the front lines. As the bombs were raining down in 1951 during the Korean War, did you know that an international delegation of women went to North Korea? They tried to go to South Korea, but the US-backed dictator, Syngman would not allow them to enter the country. But they visited churches, and they went to schools, they went to hospitals, they went to mass gravesites to document the genocide. They called for an end to the Korean War. They called for the brutality, actually, of the US air bombing campaign. But of course, they were cast off. It was the height of the Cold War. They were cast off as pro-communist and whatever. But that just shows me the courage and the fierceness of women. And who was the first person, civilian, to cross the DMZ? It was Im Soo-kyung. She was a South Korean university student who traveled by way, I think, of Europe to get to Pyongyang to join an international youth festival. And then she made the decision that she would cross the DMZ. And so she did, and she was arrested immediately and sentenced to 5 years in prison. She later became a member of the parliament. But you just see these stories that are not heard. They're not written in the textbooks. But when you actually delve deeply, you see the powerful role that women have played through their moral conviction, through their fearlessness to do what is right. And I'm just honored to be a part of that tradition, and to have done this because we have to do this. Our world is calling for this kind of leadership, kind of vision for a different kind of world. So it's been extraordinary. And the other thing that I've learned is it's just actually the recipe. You organize, you educate, you mobilize, you put pressure on members of Congress, you engage. It's not that difficult. And what I feel so grateful for to the Plowshares Fund is, and I think a large part of it is the Women's Initiative, the willingness to kind of push the traditional norms of how are we going to resolve these big issues, is believing in women and women peace builders to take on this issue that has largely been viewed from a white male national security paradigm. And it's like, we have a totally different way of looking at it. And it's so heartening to me. And it was so heartening to get, I asked Joe Cirincione if he could, send us a quote to include in our annual report. And he wrote something like, it was really Women Cross DMZ that really challenged the paradigm that that you must get to peace in order to achieve denuclearization. And I think for the last 30 years, it has been the other way. We have to force North Korea to denuclearize before we get to peace. And we're flipping that around and saying, you actually need to get to peace because North Korea is in a siege mentality. And they say, you got to drop your hostile policy. And how do you do that? You negotiate a peace agreement. And that begins the process of normalization. That begins the process of trust building. And that hopefully will lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula.
What was it like to cross the DMZ? What were you thinking as you took that same path across?
Oh my gosh, it was, as Gloria said, it was the longest day of our lives. It was so surreal. We started the morning in Kaesong, which is the ancient capital. And we had done a peace walk in Pyongyang on the wide boulevard, like on the road heading to the DMZ. And then the next day we were in Kaesong and we did a march with 2,000 North Korean women on these cobblestones and walking through these kind of narrow roads with apartment buildings. And it was such a different feel than in Pyongyang, where it was just like nobody was really there because you're on like a highway. But in Kaesong, like all the multi-generational North Koreans, like moms with their babies and like men with like their wife beater tank tops and grandmas. And I just remember locking eyes with the grandmother. She must have been in her 80s. She must have been in Korea before it was divided. And they were just cheering, and with their plastic flowers. And it just tears were just streaming down everybody's faces. And yeah, crossing the DMZ. I mean, it's this, every time I go to the DMZ, it's this cognitive dissonance because it is so lush. And I'm always there in May. It's International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament. So you have these lush rice fields. And then it's oh my God, we're in the world's most militarized zone. And so it was so confusing. I mean, literally, it is no man's land. We had to negotiate with the North Korean government, which then was also negotiating with the North Korean People's Army. And then we had to negotiate with the South Korean government, and then the UN command, which is really the US forces in Korea. And so we had requested to be able to walk some portion of that 2.5 miles, and they wouldn't, They're like, you're lucky enough we're letting you cross the DMZ, and it's too dangerous, even though it's just some highway. And, you think about in the 2000s when all the workers from South Korea would go to Kaesong, the joint industrial complex. That's the road that we took. I mean, it's certainly safe, but I would just say from an emotional perspective, it was... Yeah, it just happened so fast. And it just, I don't know, as we were crossing on the bus, it was all of a sudden we were in South Korea. And I just thought, wow, there's just this strip of land that is so symbolic of the cleaving of the Korean Peninsula. It's basically the heart of the Korean people. And I don't know. It just, it was such an emotional day. And then, of course, I was the target of all this right-wing coverage that I had said something in North Korea. And then, of course, the South Korea, and then the North Korean Rodong Shinmun wrote it in the way that they wanted to. And then the South Korean media picked it up and they wrote it. And I was basically a pariah by the time I had arrived into South Korea. So, also on a personal level, I had been informed that I would be, like attacked with acid, that they had heard some rumors that they were concerned for my safety. And so they were concerned that I should be hidden in the delegation. But it was actually Gloria Steinem who said, no, Christina's our leader. We're going to protect her. She's like, you're going to be in between me and Lema Gabowi, and we're going to protect you. And if they throw acid on you, they throw acid on me and Lema. And I just, that's where it's like having somebody that's like 80 at the time with all the like hardship and struggle and like tough, stressful, high stakes negotiations. It was just invaluable to have Gloria Steinem on that journey. So it's kind of like surreal. And when I heard you do the introduction, I'm like, wow, that sounds crazy. And then it was like, I was the one that was doing that.
I know. I had to ask. Thank you so much for sharing. It's both your work and deeply personal. And I have one more question along those lines. Why do you do this? And what keeps you going? What gives you hope?
Oh, gosh, I guess there's two ways I want to answer that. And one is because you see the impact that it's making. I mean, just like referring to being attacked. So one of the narratives that was in the mainstream media and by the detractors against us, often white men, often from former military officials in South Korea, or American military officials that were in South Korea, that we were pro-North Korean, that we were like handmaidens of the North Korean regime, that we didn't care about human rights. And, our position has always been, in order to get to denuclearization, you need peace. And in order to get to human rights, you need peace. And it was just a remarkable thing for me. This spring, the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korean human rights, Thomas Quintana, released a report of the Human Rights Council. And in it, he makes this argument that the U.S. should negotiate a peace agreement separate from a denuclearization deal, because that will be a critical factor in improving the human rights conditions in North Korea. And then he cites Women Cross DMZ, that he's been meeting with us, and that government should listen to Women Cross DMZ. And I just thought, holy moly, that's like, talk about night and day, to have the guy on North Korea human rights say, listen to these women. It just felt so redemptive. But what gives me hope? I know this is going to sound so callous, because we are facing so much hardship with COVID, with the political crisis, the uprisings, and all the violence that has resulted from it. And then, of course, the looming economic depression that is just going to impact all of our lives. But I feel like we're having a reckoning. And I think about the Arundhati Roy quote. I'm sure you've seen it, where she talks about how we are in a portal right now. And we have to do as much as we can in this moment to make sure that we make the radical, structural, systemic changes now, because we cannot return at the end of this pandemic to the way that we had lived, because it was unsustainable, because it was unjust, because too many people were insecure and left without dignity. And so I feel that it's really forcing all of us to really look deeply in our hearts about what is meaningful, what is essential, what is the bullshit that we basically will not tolerate anymore, because we have our lives, I feel like, with the pandemic, feel so tenuous, and we're here for this short period of time. And so what are we going to do to make sure that it's as beautiful for as many people and sustainable for my children and her children and for generations to come? So that's what gives me hope, is we are in this cauldron, it feels like right now, but I have faith in the spirit of human decency and goodwill that we will come out as a better society, a better country, and a better world.
Christine, thank you so much for sharing. For those among our listeners who want to get involved, where can they go to learn more?
They can go to two places. One is womencrossdmz.org. Send us an email. We've been getting a lot of people randomly saying, we want to join this movement. And it's just been so exciting because we have been building this powerful grassroots movement. And you should also go to Korea Peace Now, because we launched this campaign with other feminist women's organizations. And we are kicking butt. So please join us.
That you are. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I can't wait to see where you go next.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.